Hi, Judy from Bungalow Quilting and Yarn here, and I'm here to talk about one of the quilts in my book, Rainbow Quilts for Scrap Lovers, and that's because it has set-in seams. There's one quilt in this book called Blended Hexagons, and we have sold out of this book so many times and sold so many of these at shows, and I have promised my customers that I would do a video on set-in seams to help make things easier for them. Now this is the quilt right here. It's called Blended Hexagons, and it's a wonderful quilt, and it's almost everyone's favorite in this book because it is very, very simple to do. But the problem that people get into is they worry about these set-in seams. Now here's a row of hexagons, and here's a row of hexagons, and they're very easy to put together. But when it comes to putting the rows together, you actually have to sew this edge to this edge of this hexagon to this edge of this hexagon, and then this one to this one. And that requires a set-in seam. I'll show you a little more close up in the book. These are the rows of hexagons like this. See this? And then this edge of the hexagon gets sewn to this edge of the hexagon with a 1/4 inch seam. And then this one gets sewn to this one with a 1/4 inch seam, but you're making a pivot at that point. And that is where the set-in seam comes in. So today we're going to talk about those set-in seams and how easy it is to do them. They really shouldn't be a worry. They really shouldn't bother you, but they are a little bit scary for beginners. So a lot of people will stand on their head practically to avoid doing a set-in seam, but you really don't have to do that. You don't have to be so worried about it. It's really not that big of a deal. One way of really simplifying the whole thing is by marking your 1/4 inch seam allowances. So if you're sewing a garment, it's going to be a 1/2 inch or a 5/8 inch seam, and there are a lot of times there are set-in seams in garments, so I don't want you to be afraid of those either. So you're going to measure from your edge to your 1/4 inch seam and draw a line. And you're going to do it on all 4 sides. I've got these wonderful templates that are my Fast to Cut templates from C&T Publishing. They come in a package of 3.5, 4.5, and a 5.5 inch. And what I've done, because there's such a lovely 1/4 inch mark along the edge there, is I have put the 1/4 inch line on the edge of the square, and I am drawing with a pen. I'm drawing a line here, and then I turn it and I draw a 1/4 inch seam allowance line again here along here, and then that marks the exact spot in the corner where those 2 1/4 inch seam allowances intersect. And that's important for set-in seams, because when you do a set-in seam, you do not sew your 2 pieces right sides together and then stitch right to the end like you normally would in normal piecing. Now, like I said, I'm going to do a 4 patch, but I'm going to do one of the 4 patches as a set-in seam, and you're going to say that's ridiculous. We don't do 4 patches with set-in seams. So we don't, but I want to show you exactly how to do that set-in seam, and this is a simple way to demonstrate that. Okay, so I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew along that 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop exactly where that intersection is, and I'm going to leave that last little piece part unsewn, and then I'm going to press my seam allowances open. So here we go. Okay, so I've pressed these seam allowances open. I've sewn my 1/4 inch seam. I should do it on this side, you can see it better. Okay, I've sewn my 1/4 inch seam and I've stopped at that intersection. So you see, I've pressed them open, and I do have a little opening there. See that? I do have a little edge that's not sewn together. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this one to this piece here, all right? And I'm going to do the exact same thing where I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew on my 1/4 inch seam allowance line, and I'm going to stop at that intersection. I'm going to make sure that my edges are lined up perfectly here. The edges are lined perfectly here, and they're aligned perfectly here in terms of which one you're sewing it to, right? You're not sewing it to this blue one here, you're sewing it to the printed one, okay? So see that's going to line up exactly there, and we're going to stop at that intersection right there. Okay, so now I've sewn, the seams are pressed open. I've sewn this one to this one with 1/4 inch seam and stopped at that intersection. This one to this one, and I stopped at that intersection. Now look at that. I've got that nice little mitered edge there. They're all open. See that? Now if you're worried about there being a weakness because we've stopped at the intersection there, we've stopped at the intersection there, and we've stopped at the intersection here, okay? Now if you're worried about there being a weakness, go back, take a back stitch, 1 or 2 stitches backstitch there. All right. I promise you that if you're doing this and this is a quilt, once it's quilted and it's quilted tightly, if you're doing, machine quilting over the top, you just are not going to experience much of a weakness at all. But if that makes you more comfortable, definitely backstitch. But when you're backstitching, make sure that you don't go beyond that intersection. You're going to run into problems with set-in seams if you go beyond that intersection. Okay? All right, so now they're all open and ready for me to add my next piece, this piece here, the bright green one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to join it so far up to the top of the screen here. I'm going to join this piece to this piece. I'm going to stop at that intersection once again. And I'm going to pull these aside. I'm going to pull all these away so that they're not interfering with my sewing this one to this one. And I'm stopping at that intersection. I think you guys can see where I'm going with this now, because once this is sewn to this, I'm going to sew it to this, and you'll have your set-in seam made completely and perfectly. So I'm going to go and sew this to this, and I'm going to press that open, and I'm going to stop at that intersection. Okay, so this is sewn to this. Now here's where my set-in seam comes in. This is the set-in seam. Okay, do you see that this is sewn to this, and this is sewn to this? This piece right here was the piece that I was going to set in, because these 3 were all sewn together already, and that was easy. I just sewed this to this and this to this, but I stopped at those little intersections. Now I sewed this to this, and now this one is going to get sewn to this, and that's my set-in seam. That is my Y seam. My Y seam is occurring here and here. I don't like to call it Y seam. I don't know. I think that that's complicated because you're thinking, where's the Y? It's a set-in seam. It's where it's set in. And so you can see that this would work very well with a hexagon or with a diamond shape. But now I'm going to go ahead. Now see, I've stopped at that intersection. I have stopped each and every time. Oops, I'm going to pull this better into view here. I have stopped at that intersection each and every time. And that allowed me to be able to pull these 3 away, these 3 pieces away, so that when I want to put this in, I can do it. See that? Now that's going to be perfect. I'm going to sew from here, and I'm going to stop right there and press, and then I'm going to show you what that looks like with that set-in seam. Look at that. There's my set-in seam. I sewed this to this and this to this, and this right here is where the Y occurred. So I made a little bird's nest, but that's where the Y occurred, right there. So I'm going to go ahead, and you can now, if you'd rather, now press your seam allowances flat like this. Initially, when I started it, I wanted those seam allowances to be open so I could see what the heck I was doing. But now you can go ahead and press those flat if you want to. And then this is how it's going to come out looking. It looks very, very good. You can see that if you were joining a bunch of hexagons and you had points that looked that good, you'd be pretty happy with it. So there's your ABCs of set-in seams. Okay, so now when I showed you with the squares, I want to show you with the actual quilt. This is the only quilt in the book that actually has set-in seams. Now, like I showed you on the page in the book, you're sewing the peaks to the valleys and the valleys to the peaks, and those are the set-in seams. So here is the peak of one of my hexagons, and right here is the valley of the quilt that I'm sewing it to, the already put together ones. So there's that little opening. Remember I said you don't sew right to the end when you're doing set-in seams. You stop 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. So that's this piece right here, okay? This is where I joined 2 hexagons. And this is 1 hexagon getting joined in the middle of those 2, because remember it's like a honeycomb type pattern. So I'm sewing 1/4 inch along, and notice that my seams are all pressed open, because where my seam is pressed open, that center right there, that's going to line up. See how that lines up right with that seam? This lines up and this lines up. So I know that the center of this is where I'm going to put my needle stop down, and then I'm going to pivot. These are only a slight set-in seam. They're not a 90-degree angle. Okay, so I'm sewing at my 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to, when I get to that center, there. Now my needle is down. I'm going to, now here's the other section of the hexagon. See that? That's the other section of the hexagon being sewn to the hexagon below it. And I'm just doing that nice slight pivot. Make sure it comes together underneath. Okay. And then you just keep going. Now the one underneath here is slightly longer. See how my seam allowances aren't matching up there? So what do you do when you have that? Well, first of all, when you have something that's longer than the top piece, you can't fudge too much. But the longer piece should always be closest to the feed dogs. It should always be on the bottom. And then you can always take your wooden skewer. This is a pin. I don't like to use a pin, but you gently, because this machine doesn't have dual feed, so you gently are going to feed that bottom piece in without making a crease. You don't want to make a big lumpy crease, but you can just gently feed it so that those seam allowances get closer together and match up better. Okay. So now I'm going to come up again to what the quilt on the bottom, the hexagon on the bottom now has the peak, and the ones on the top now have the valley. Okay, so now you can see that. See that? There's the point. There's the point underneath, and this is the V shape. This is the valley, the V shape piece where the two hexagons came together. So there's where all my hexagons are coming together. I've got that piece where it's going to be in the middle. There's a lot of pieces of fabric coming together there, so you kind of have to hold that flat either with, like I said, a wooden skewer, which I like to do a bamboo skewer and to hold things down. Don't want to use metal, even though I'm using a pin right now, because if it hits you in the eye, or if the needle hits it, it's going to come to hit you in the eye. Now, I'm going to lift this up. Hopefully you'll be able to see. If I lift up that presser foot maybe and move the camera angle better. Well, no. So now I'm going to pivot. There we go. I had a better angle. So now we're going to pivot. See that piece on the bottom? And we're straightening out the piece on the top. My seam allowances are magically matching up just perfectly right here. Okay, now this time, the peak is on the top. See that? There's the peak, and there's the valley where they came through, and look at that, where I've left it open. You never sew right to the edge when you're doing set-in seams. You leave that slight opening, and now I'm going to pivot right in the middle of my seam allowance. This is why we leave, this is why with set-in seams, you always press your seam allowances open. Now we're coming up again to where the stays flat, where we're joining. So there's the peak, see that? And here's the valley. Again, I'll show you one more time. You can see there's some stress on my stitches there, right there, you can see that. But once this is quilted tightly, that won't be an issue. I probably will quilt this more tighter than most quilts because of that. I'm going to make sure that it's a very close, when I take it to the long armor, I'm going to make sure that it's very close, quilted very closely. Alright, we're almost to the end, and then when I'm done, I'm going to flip it over so that you can see where those have come together, those set-in seams, how nice they look. Okay, so now coming to, this has the valley, see that? This has the valley, and this has the peak. We're coming up on that. Here's the middle of my seam allowance, we're going to pivot. Another thing you can do to mark your seam allowances is there's this product by Sulky, and they, it's Sticky Solvy, And they are coming out with a tape for it on my suggestion to use as a 1/4 inch seam marker. Sew right along the edge of that tape. And what happens then is that it just, when you wash the quilt, it just washes right out. You don't have to worry about going back and removing it. Also kind of acts as a stabilizer so that it's not stretching your fabrics inadvertently, which we all tend to do when we're handling our fabrics a lot. We do tend to stretch them a little bit. That edge is a little bit uneven there. Sometimes that happens. Okay, so now I'm coming up. Now this time the valley is on the top and the peak is on the bottom. See that? Peak is on the bottom, valley is on the top. But I think what I'm going to do is stop here so that I can show you what these look like when they all do come together. Right, so here's my set-in seam. I'm going to work it with the iron. I'm going to press it out really good with the iron. There's one of them. This one's really good. Here's my set-in seam over here. And I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to press them with the iron so that I work them. But that looks pretty good. And you'll have good results like that too if you remember to follow the tips that I've given you in this video. And make sure you pick up Rainbow Quilts for Scrap Lovers and Quilts for Scrap Lovers. You'll love them.